The life of a reader is full of surprises. One of these, a page of Art and Illusion, Ernst Gombrich's great book, will be the starting point of my reflections. From the very first moment I came across that page, nearly 50 years ago, I got a strong impression which has stayed with me under different forms up to the present day. The page is included in a chapter entitled Truth and the Stereotype. On the left-hand side, you will see an English lithograph dated 1836, representing the western facade of the Cathedral of Notre Dame at Chartres. On the right-hand side, a 20th century photograph of the same facade. The difference between the lithograph and the photograph is evident. In the former, 2 rows of pointed Gothic arches. In the latter, 2 rows of round Romanesque arches. The author of the lithograph, impregnated with romantic stereotypes, regarded French cathedrals as the emblem of the age of faith, embodied by the Gothic style. In his mental universe, Gombrich remarks, the Romanesque windows of the western facade had no place. Today, in the era of Photoshop, everybody is familiar with the idea that photographs can be manipulated in all sorts of ways. Let me immediately add that Gombrich had a predictably sophisticated attitude towards the objectivity of photographs. Art and Illusion begins by showing that photographs are also, in some way, constructed images, an issue Gombrich repeatedly analyzed with great subtlety. But a comparison with the photograph of Chartres Cathedral and a fortiori a visual inspection of the cathedral itself shows that the English lithographer, notwithstanding his concern to provide a topographically correct representation of the church, had distorted reality, unless somebody were able to demonstrate, to mention a completely absurd hypothesis that the Romanesque windows on the western facade of Chartres Cathedral are the result of restoration work that took place after 1836. Thus far, more or less, Gombrich. Now I venture to advance a corollary of his argument, extending the implications of the 19th century lithograph of Chartres Cathedral to any kind of testimony, whether visual, verbal, or whatever. Any testimony speaks, first of all, deliberately or not, of itself, of the ways in which it has been produced. In this case, of the romantic stereotypes which inspired the lithographer. But it also speaks in a more or less deliberate, more or less distorted way of an outside reality, in this case, Chartres Cathedral. Those two sides are connected by a very close relationship. One could compare them to 2 sides of a sheet of paper. To understand what a testimony can say about the world in which it has been produced, we should inscribe it in a series. For instance, the series based on 19th century lithographs. This would allow us to make a further step exploring the relationship between that testimony and its referential dimension, the reality which it represents or claims to represent. A generalization based on a blatant case of image distortion, a lithograph inadvertently turning Romanesque windows into Gothic windows might suggest a relativist conclusion. If we assume that all testimonies, including photographs, imply some kind of distortion, the boundary between true and false testimonies will disappear. And Gombrich's appeal to the reality principle, mediated by the 20th century photograph of Chartres Cathedral, would become impossible. A similar objection has been raised against Gombrich by W.J.T. Mitchell, who argues for, quote, a hard, rigorous relativism that regards knowledge as a social product, unquote. An attitude very distant, he insisted, from, quote, some facile relativism that abandons standards of truth or the possibility of valid knowledge, unquote. But are rigorous relativists able to decide whether the representation of Gothic windows on the western facade of the Chartres Cathedral displayed in the English lithograph implies a distortion of reality? This question, I'm unable to say whether it is or not a rhetorical question, points out what is at stake in this debate. The meaning, no more, no less, we ascribe to terms such as knowledge, truth, reality. Gombrich was so deeply aware of the general implications of the examples he analyzed, including the one I mentioned, that as a motto for the chapter Truth and the Stereotype, he chose a passage on transcendental schematism taken from Kant's Critique of Pure Reason. The Kantian, although originally Greek, word schema is at the very center of Gombrich's comment on the English lithograph. Quote, clearly, if we had pointed out to the artist his mistake, he could have further modified his scheme and rounded the windows. But such matching will always be a step-by-step process. How long it takes and how hard it is will depend on the choice of the initial schema to be adapted to the task of serving as a portrait. I believe, this is Gombrich, that in this respect, these humble documents do indeed tell us a lot about the procedure of any artist who wants to make a truthful record of an individual truth. He begins not with his visual impression, but with his idea or concept, unquote. Throughout his book, Gombrich provides a compelling argument for dismantling the notion, which goes back to Ruskin, of innocent eye. His demonstration might be taken in a narrow sense, as if it would apply to images alone, or even to the subset of images, aiming to represent reality through pictorial illusion. But my aforementioned extension to any testimonies, visual, verbal, or whatever, is, if I'm not mistaken, implicit in Gombrich's argument. Let me quote a passage in which Gombrich uses as a synonym of innocent eye the word unbiased. Quote, Gombrich, the postulate of an unbiased eye demands the impossible. It is the business of the living organism to organize, for where there is life, there is not only hope, as the proverb says, but also fears, guesses, expectations, which sort and model the incoming messages, testing and transforming and testing again, unquote. Unbiased, guesses, testing and testing again. Gombrich describes the production of images in terms evoking scientific knowledge. This analogy does not aim to turn the scientist into an artist, rather the opposite. This is why W.J.T. Mitchell rejected Gombrich's alleged scientism, advocating the aforementioned rigorous relativism he placed symbolically and, in my view, problematically or revealing under the sign of Feyerabend. But Gombrich's hero is rather Leonardo, the artist-scientist par excellence. Through a sequence of trial and error, Gombrich argues, echoing Popper, the artist or the scientist is able to trace a distinction between schemata and biases, hypotheses and prejudices, discarding the latter and approaching the former in order to represent or to know reality. Here comes my question, the first in a series. Can the analogy between artist and scientist put forward by Gombrich in the aforementioned anti-relativist perspective be extended to the historian as well? According to a popular image, historians start from hypotheses which are tested on the basis of a careful reading of the evidence and then discarded or modified or turned into more or less solid, although potentially revocable, conclusions. But this seemingly innocent description of the historian's craft conceals several difficulties, related above all to the stage of testing and testing again, as Gombrich put it. Is the historian's testing compatible with experiments? In his unfinished methodological reflections, published after his death, Marc Bloch raised this question, answering for the negative. Experiments are not allowed to historians. This impossibility, Bloch wrote, I'm quoting, embodies the great, irredeemable weakness of our research vis-à-vis the majority of natural sciences, unquote. This drastic statement, which can be read in the first draft of Bloch's Métier d'historien, was followed by a series of distinctions and nuances, which were expanded in the next draft of his work. Other disciplines, like history, achieve knowledge indirectly through traces. But, Bloch remarked, quote, it seems obvious that any human phenomenon beyond the minimum threshold of complexity cannot be deliberately reproduced or provoked, unquote. Even experiments conducted in the domain of individual psychology would be impossible in the domain of collective psychology. Quote, this is Bloch again, one would not dare, even assuming that one could deliberately unleash, that is, for a cognitive purpose, a panic or a movement based on religious fanaticism, unquote. The implications of this remark went beyond psychology. Clearly, Bloch was also alluding to the economic and social phenomena which Annales, the journal he had founded in 1929, along with Lucien Febvre, had put at the very heart of the debates among historians. The impossibility of conducting experiments, pointed out by Bloch, as well as by countless historians after him, apparently sets up rigid limitations to the process of testing and testing again, which Gombrich and Popper before him evoked. Among recent attempts to overcome the obstacle, we can mention Natural Experiments of History, a collection of essays edited by Jared Diamond and James A. Robinson. One of those essays approaches the relationship between the collapse of the Ancien Régime and birth of capitalism in the following terms. Quote, in the natural sciences, the solution of a problem like this would be to conduct an experiment. For instance, we would ideally take a group of countries that were alike, say all of them having a relatively backward institutional landscape, and abolish Ancien Régime institutions in a randomly chosen subset of these countries, the treatment group, while leaving unchanged the institutions of the rest, the control group. Then we could observe what happens to the relative prosperity of these two groups. In reality, of course, we are unable to conduct such an experiment. Unquote. Since the past cannot be manipulated, the authors of the essay point out we must rely upon a natural experiment based on comparison, an alternative already mentioned by Bloch. Comparison is a fascinating topic, but I will not be dealing with it here. I will rather try to explore an apparently blocked trajectory, comparing through a series of successive approximations, not the natural sciences in general, but more specifically, double-blind experiments in medical science. Hopefully, analogies and divergences emerging from this comparison will shed some light on the historian's craft from an unexpected point of view, justified, however, by the traditional exchanges between history and medicine, two forms of knowledge born in ancient Greece, which shared the term historia, inquiry, and a series of mutual interactions. Historians have been often inspired by a cognitive model based on semiotics, supported by a sustained reflection on the relationship between anomalies and norms, between cases and general rules. A double-blind experiment can be described as follows. A group of doctors, researchers, nurses is asked to administer a drug whose effectiveness must be tested to a group of patients, as well as a placebo, an inert product, whose aspect is indistinguishable from the previous one. Their respective nature is ignored by the patients who have randomly been given each of them, as well as by the doctors, researchers, and nurses who administer them and keep a record of effects and variations. This randomized controlled trial, RCT, thus implies a twofold blindness, with one relevant exception: the person or persons conducting the experiment. The history of double-blind experiments is a long and tortuous one. A concern for testing the effects of medications, as opposed to suggestion and self-suggestion, first emerged in polemical contexts, in the debate on mesmerism at the end of the 18th century, in the debate on hypnosis 1 century later. Ultimately, the issue has been taken up by mainstream medical science. In 1917, Dorald Solomon, the American pharmacologist, administered an inert product or placebo to a control group in order to test the effectiveness of a drug. An experiment he labeled Blind Test in a 2-page paper entitled The Crucial Test of Therapeutic Evidence. A few decades later, it was realized that keeping patients in the dark about the nature of the administered product was not enough. Effects due to suggestion could be unwittingly conveyed even by those who administered the product. Hence, the use of double-blind experiments. But they had to overcome stubborn resistance. for a long time, its implications, as well as limits, nature, and the very existence of the placebo effect have raised many doubts. In the past few decades, the debate has taken a new turn due to the ongoing research on the placebo effect from a neurobiological perspective. I will not go beyond a few elementary items of information due to my very limited knowledge in this matter. I will tentatively consider the placebo effect as a model, meaning a miniature and extremely simplified image of some fundamental phenomena of human behavior. Moreover, I will look at double-blind experiments as a simplified model of the perspective in which historians approach or could approach those phenomena. I would like to emphasize the fact that these are mere hypotheses. What I'm doing is an experiment on an experiment. This twofold hypothetical analogy is based on 4 elements. A, the subjects of double-blind experiments are individuals belonging to different animal species, including our own. B, those individuals experience emotions, fears, expectations, and so forth that can have a bearing on the experimental results. C, those emotions can be experienced not only by patients, but also by researchers involved in the experiment. D, in order to protect the outcome of the experiment, both the patients and the researchers' emotions must be neutralized by keeping both of them in the dark as far as the experiment is concerned. How is all this related to history and historical research? The answer must be looked for, first of all, within the placebo effect, as well as within the opposite phenomenon that has been labeled nocebo effect, that is, phenomena of suggestion and autosuggestion elicited respectively by hopes and fears, in some cases the latter, according to a much debated hypothesis, could bring a person to his or her death. The discovery of how suggestion and autosuggestion can affect human behavior is etched within a long trajectory, which in our tradition begins with the ruthless attack on religion and its psychological roots, launched by Epicurus and his followers. First of all, Lucretius. Primus in orbe Deos fecit timor. Fear first created gods in the world. This line by Petronius must be read along with Tacitus' profound remark, fingunt simul credunque. They create and at the same time believe in what they have created. Religions, a human creation, are born from fear and generate fear, are born from pain and soothe pain. The catchy title of a book written by 2 specialists, Arthur and Elaine Shapiro, and addressed to a broad audience, points at this long trajectory. The powerful placebo from ancient priest to modern physician. To identify religions with the placebo or timebo effect would be grotesque. Any conjecture on the origins of religions does not explain the meaning they acquired in societies as diverse as possible. Unintended consequences are, as always in human history, the norm. But the miniature, simplified model based on double-blind experiments may shed a retrospective light on a critical tradition based on a ferocious demystification of the psychological roots of religion, along with a full recognition of its extraordinary effectiveness. the mannequins displayed in Hogarth's etching entitled Some Principal Inhabitants of the Moon, Royalty, Episcopacy, and Law, 1724, embody and perform ecclesiastical and secular power, not although they are empty, but because they are empty. Goya, possibly inspired either directly or indirectly by Hogarth's etching, represented in one of his capriccios a woman kneeling at the feet of a monk's frock hanging from a tree. In the preparatory drawing, this one, the face inside the frock is erased. In the etching, the sinister grimace of a mannequin emerges. In both versions, the frock is empty. Lo que puede un sastre, what a tailor can do, the caption reads. So far, I've dealt with the placebo effect and its historical implications. The double-blind experiment, which seeks to weaken the placebo effect, may be connected to a different sphere, that of historical research. From res gestae, we shift to historia rerum gestarum. It would be tempting to regard the expectations nourished by patients and doctors being kept in the dark to avoid interferences with the strategy of those who conduct the experiment as an equivalent of the bias or romantic prejudice which, in the English lithograph analyzed by Gombrich, turned the Romanesque windows of the western facade of Chartres Cathedral into Gothic windows. But from this hypothetical analogy, a crucial divergence immediately emerges. In the double-blind experiment, the expectations nourished by doctors and patients must be analyzed, but only as a disturbance, comparable to a background noise, which must be weakened as much as possible. The historian's work, if inspired by a concern for testing the evidence, is, as we shall see, quite different. I will approach this issue from a circumscribed point of view, which points to the direction which Marc Bloch declared closed forever to conduct experiments in the domain of history. In his book, Diritto e Ragione, Teoria del Garantismo Penale, Law and Reason, Protection of Civil Liberties in a Theoretical Perspective, Luigi Ferraioli wrote, quote, "A trial is, in a certain sense, the only case of an historiographic experiment. Testimonies are asked to act de vivo, since they are not only summoned directly, but also compared, submitted to cross-examination, and asked to reenact, like in a psychodrama, the events which are at the center of the trial." Unquote. Nearly 2 centuries before, Volney, addressing himself to the pupils of the École Normale in the 3rd year of the French Revolution, proclaimed, quote, "History is nothing else than a genuine inquiry on facts, enquête, that is, historia. The historian who is aware of the task must regard himself as a judge who summons those who either narrated or witnessed the facts, submitting them to cross-examination, interrogating them, trying to find truth." Unquote. The analogy between historian and judge is an old one, but Ferraioli gave a new twist to it by connecting it to experiment. Being a jurist, he referred to trials in the making. Historians can work on court records which were produced centuries ago. In those cases, developing Ferraioli's suggestion, we might speak of a, quote, historiographic experiment raised to the square, unquote. Testimonies are asked to act de vivo in the present by the judge, and later they will be re-examined by the historian as traces related to the past. As in Chinese boxes, the latter experiment includes the former. In order to analyze this historiographic experiment, I will focus on some trials I am particularly familiar with, conducted by the Roman Inquisition in the 16th and 17th century. These trials are dominated by secrecy. Interrogations are secret. Proceedings are secret. The defendants do not know the provenance of the accusations raised against them. When, exceptionally, they could rely upon an attorney who had access to the proceedings, the accusers' names were concealed by initials. Only the judge, the inquisitor, or his vicar, had a full control over the trial's development and was able to set up the elements of his historiographic experiment. The other participants, meaning defendants, witnesses, had a very limited knowledge of what was going on in the court. They acted, so to speak, in the dark. Outside the dark, there was the inquisitor who tested his hypotheses, his biases in the trial. Even in this context, initial hypotheses were sometimes disproven. A few centuries later, those court records are read and analyzed by an historian who starts from hypotheses, information, and, why not, biases, which are widely different from those that can be ascribed to inquisitors, defendants, and witnesses from the past. A specific example will hopefully clarify the implications of the analogy between this historiographic experiment raised to the square and double-blind experiments. Many years ago, in the Udine Ecclesiastical Archives, I came across nearly 50 trials of different length, which took place between the late 16th and late 17th centuries. I analyzed them in my first book, I Benandanti, 1966, translated into English as The Night Battles. The defendants, men and women, usually peasants, told the inquisitors that they were born with a shirt that is wrapped in the coal. Therefore, they were benandanti, literally those who go for the good, compelled to live in spirit 3 or 4 times a year, to fight with fennel branches for the fertility of the crops against witches and wizards who would use sorghum sticks as weapons. The inquisitors, faced with those unheard of tales, full of extraordinary details, tried, on the one hand, to convince the Benandanti to confess that they themselves were witches and wizards, their own alleged enemies. On the other, to admit that the night battles they participated in spirit were no more than the witches' Sabbath. At first, the Benandanti indignantly rejected the inquisitors' oblique suggestions, but later, after a clash lasting half a century, they ultimately introjected, albeit among strong resistances, the diabolical image which had been thrust upon them. The cultural gap between inquisitors and Benandanti was filled, albeit only partially, by violence in those Friulian trials, mostly of a symbolical kind. The historian, in this case myself, who tries to interpret those documents, knows at the same time more or less as much as the actors involved in the trials, meaning the inquisitors, the witnesses, the Benandanti. The inquisitors' intellectual categories look distant. The Benandantis even more so. But distance, both intellectual and chronological, is not necessarily an obstacle. It can turn itself into an asset, that is, critical distance. The historian tries to put the past, as the saying goes, into perspective. He will try to avoid as much as possible what E.P. Thompson labeled, quote, the enormous condescension of posterity, unquote. But the actors on the trial stage will appear blindly immersed in the limited perspective of their own lives. Seen from the future, and with the dubious benefit of hindsight, the present necessarily looks blind. What is the aim of the historiographic experiment raised to the square which the historian conducts? Why is he or she looking at the evidence? To check a factual reality comparable to the effectiveness of a drug? Both yes and no. The trial's development must be reconstructed in detail, of course, but the historian will especially focus on the background noise, hopes, expectations, fears fueled by the benandanti, the witnesses, the judges, and their interaction in the trial. Placebo leaps to the fore. As in one of those images used by Gestalt psychologists, the relationship between solids and voids, between forefront and background, is subverted. We are confronted with an image which replicates the double-blind experiment in an inverted form. As I had anticipated earlier, the comparison, hypothetical and provisional, between double-blind experiments and historical research did not aim to find analogies. Divergences would have been relevant as well. The documents I'm talking about are, for many reasons, particularly appropriate to work as tools for contrastive analysis. They are certainly anomalous, but anomalies can help to decipher the norm, since they necessarily include it, and not the other way round. The benandanti trials are based on events which are not only intangible, but also, by definition, unattainable to external observers. The lethargies or swoonings during which the spirit of those born in a coal left the motionless body to join the nocturnal battles. Those silent experiences, which the benandanti tried to translate into words, came to us through the transcriptions, often inadequate and incomplete, made by the Inquisition's notaries. In some cases, the notaries translated the benandanti's narratives from the Friulian dialect into Italian. Historians, as Mark Bloch pointed out, inevitably rely upon traces. But in the case I'm talking about, this limitation seems particularly acute. The analysis is based on traces which are A, indirect, in a double or triple degree, B, generated by an event which is by definition unacceptable, since it is part of an inaccessible private sphere, C, distorted, one should never forget this, by a context like the Inquisition trial, sometimes dominated by physical pressure, meaning torture, and always by symbolic violence. Indirect, untestable, distorted data, but first of all, data, which are, according to the Latin etymology of the word, given rather than constructed, as in the double-blind experiment, in which everything is set up from the very beginning, the randomized distribution of drugs and placebos. To sum up, the aims of the historiographic experiment raised to the square and the double-blind experiment are the same. That is, to achieve a certified truth. Let's say a scientifically certified truth. Yet, their respective trajectories are different. Why are they different? Because the rationality which inspires those who conduct the double-blind experiment aims to put under control other people's emotions, patients, doctors, nurses. The rationality which inspires the historian aims, on the contrary, to take the actor's emotions as seriously as possible, and then to turn them into an object of analysis. The benandanti trials are literally soaked by those emotions. I'm all sweaty. I cannot stop sweating because of the great mental effort the benandante Michele Soppe told the inquisitor, who was trying to make him confess that he had attended the witches' meetings. After many hesitations, Michele confessed. He died in jail 1 year after the interrogations in 1650. Clearly, those nocturnal journeys were a deeply intense experience for the Benandanti. How can we speak about them? And how can we label them? Here we are confronted with a difficulty which is at the very center of the historian's craft. The relationship between the historian's idiom and the actor's idiom. Most of the Benandanti men and women said that they went to their meetings in spirit. But in 1606, Gasparo of Palmanova declared that, quote, actually it is true that it also seems to me that I go out as a Benandante in a dream, unquote. We're entitled to use a word like dreams, as somebody did, but we have to point out that the Benandante's ecstatic experiences were inscribed in a cultural pattern which left very narrow scope for individual variations. Since the word dream means something different for us, it might weaken or suppress the distance between us and them. These terminological difficulties, a discussion about them could go on forever, have no place whatsoever within the framework of double-blind experiments. As I mentioned before, those experiments often involve animals belonging to species different from ours. They also imply a randomized administration of both the drug to be tested and the placebo. As I received this information from a biologist, I asked him why. Just in case, he replied. Then he added that a drug may induce in an individual belonging to any animal species unforeseeable bodily reactions which must be controlled by administering a placebo as well. Reflecting on this exchange, I told myself that expectations, fears, and hopes are animal reactions which disregard the boundary between nature and culture. The divergence must be located elsewhere. The human language used by patients, doctors, or nurses involved in the double-blind experiment is absolutely irrelevant for the experiment's aims. On the contrary, the language used in the evidence is absolutely crucial to the historian, even in the case of silent testimonies, images or objects which must be deciphered through verbal descriptions. The historian relies upon the language of daily life which he or she shares with most of the evidence. From a cognitive point of view, this contiguity was, according to Marc Bloch, absolutely negative. Quote, Bloch. The great advantage of chemistry over history is that it deals with realities which, by nature, could not name themselves. Unquote. Bloch's irony half conceals a problem which is not easy to solve. Testimonies from the past confront us with a changing terminology, widely different from the rigid, conventional one usually associated with natural sciences. Is this terminological fluidity compatible with the rigor of demonstration? Can historical hypotheses be submitted to an objective test, allowing a distinction between truth and falsehood? An answer to those questions will inevitably start from the often mentioned analogy between the judge and the historian. Eric Hobsbawm has reworked it with strong polemical overtones. Quote, the procedures of the law court, which insist on the supremacy of the evidence as much as historical researchers, and often in much the same manner, demonstrate that difference between historical fact and falsehood is not ideological. When an innocent person is tried for murder and wishes to prove his or her innocence, what is required is the techniques not of the postmodern theorist, but of the old-fashioned historian, as Hobsbawm. According to Dipesh Chakrabarty, who quoted this passage, Hobsbawm, quote, provides some unwitting evidence of his history's close ties to law and other instruments of government, unquote. A bizarre remark, for two reasons. To assume that Hobsbawm is unaware of the ties, ancient and well-known, between history and law is gratuitous. Equally gratuitous is Chakrabarty's suggestion, which immediately follows, that such ties would imply that in order to write the history of minorities, one should get rid of traditional methods of proof. According to this kind of logic, the very idea of writing a history of minorities should be discarded, since for some millennia, writing has been closely connected to the instruments of government. Walter Benjamin's line, often quoted as a mantra, rub history against the grain, means, first of all, to read historical testimonies also, not only, but also against the intentions of those who produced them. The historiographical experiment Raised to the Square I mentioned before, which analyzes Inquisition trials trying to rescue the voices of the persecuted minorities, may be placed in this perspective. Some elements which the inquisitors, those distant experimentators, were unable to control, today may open up the possibility of a reading which will be different from theirs. I'd been tempted for a moment, as a homage to Arnaldo Momigliano's famous essay, History Between Medicine and Rhetoric, to place these reflections under a title like History Between Medicine and Law, but I would not like to seem presumptuous. What for a long time fascinated me in double-blind experiments has been the coexistence of a concern for proof, which physicians share with historians and judges, and an acute, much more unusual awareness of the possibility that those who do research may unwillingly distort its results through a projection of expectations and biases, along with hypotheses and schemata. One must sterilize the instruments of analysis I've been repeating to myself for many years. But the first instrument which must be sterilized is, of course, the researcher himself or herself. This difficult process of self-control is symbolically embodied in the split between those who conduct the double-blind experiment in complete awareness and those who perform it, doctors, nurses, and so forth, patients, in complete ignorance. I will come back in a moment to this asymmetry and its implications. Here, I would like to stress once again that the positive outcome of the experiment depends on the darkness in which it takes place. Therefore, on the impossibility of distinguishing between medicament and placebo. Otherwise, the data will be contaminated and the experiment will fail. The nightmare of data contamination will ring a bell in those who are even vaguely familiar with a discipline dealing with the transmission of texts. No specific has yet been discovered against contamination, reads the often quoted closing sentence of the second edition, 1949, of Paul Maas' Text Critique, Textual Criticism, a slim book which displayed with concise, geometric elegance the eminently technical features of textual philology. But the implications of this seemingly arcane discipline intersect our daily life at every moment. We endlessly deal with duplicated texts which recapitulate in various forms the stages of a long historical trajectory, from handwritten transcription to print to electronic cut and paste. A series of metaphorical exchanges between biology and textual criticism and the other way round, families or genealogical trees or manuscripts, copy or duplication of DNA, reveal a deep theme of the culture we belong. The ideal model of textual transmission analyzed by Paul Maas implies, on the one hand, that no copyist contaminated, that is, compared different manuscripts. On the other, that all copyists made mistakes. A copyist's right conjecture, not pointed out as such, may look like a contamination. Therefore, it would disturb the mechanical reconstruction, which is Maas' aim, of the stemma codicum or family tree, which describes the relationship between different manuscripts or groups of manuscripts. In other words, according to Maas' model, the philologist must try to amend on the basis of conjectures, obviously not gratuitous, but based on the knowledge of the author's style or usus scribendi, corrupted textual passages. Copyists must limit themselves to copying. Their inevitable mistakes, which Maas classified according to labels that became part of standard philological lexicon, paved the way to a reconstruction of the manuscript families, a preliminary step to a conjectural reconstruction of the archetype. A textual philologist who works on the copyist's mistakes, whose activity as potential philologists is regarded as a disturbance. The model which emerges from Maas' crystal clear prose will inevitably evoke the double-blind experiment, in this case aimed at reconstructing the past. A completely different perspective was put forward by Giorgio Pasquali, the Italian philologist, first in his review of Maas' text critique, double the length of the volume reviewed. Then in his great book, Storia della tradizione e critica del testo, History of Textual Tradition and Textual Criticism, 1934, and then republished with additions in 1952. The second edition of Pasquali's book included an essay by Maas, enlarged by the author and translated by Pasquali himself, a detail witnessing the mutual esteem between the two scholars. The strong divergence in their respective approaches was immediately evident. Pasquali emphasized his distance from Maas in the very first page of his book. Quote, in order to turn a set of logical, therefore abstract norms into a historically based method, one must not refrain from details, unquote. On the basis of a great number of closely analyzed cases, Pasquali showed that contamination, that is, comparison between different manuscripts, which Maas had excluded from his assumptions, had been common practice since antiquity. Copyists, better to say ancient editors, compared, made conjectures, interpreted difficult passages. Hence, Pasquali's conclusion, a close inquiry on manuscript testimonies, in other words, the history of manuscript tradition, is the necessary premise of textual criticism. The close connection between those two stages emerged from Pasquali's book, announced in its very title. This brief and absolutely inadequate presentation of the divergence between Pasquali and Maas is apparently unrelated to the topic of my reflections, but only apparently. In fact, that divergence points to the example I started from, Gombrich's comparison between the 19th century lithograph representing the western facade of the Chartres Cathedral and the photograph of the same facade. As you may recall, starting from the undeliberate distortion of the copyist lithographer, the Romanesque windows turned into Gothic ones, I extended to all testimonies the implications of Gombrich's example. To evaluate the referential value of a testimony, we must first analyze what the testimony says, above all, undeliberately, about itself. As you may see, my argument was a paraphrasis and the generalization of Pasquali's. The history of tradition is the necessary premise of textual criticism. Pasquali's book has never been translated, although it has circulated widely among classical philologists of all countries. What has been translated, luckily, is The Genesis of Lachmann's Method by Sebastiano Timpanaro, a highly original scholar who had been Pasquale's pupil and developed and updated his book. In Timpanaro's harsh, sometimes unjustified criticism addressed to mass text critique, I'm inclined to see, besides a thoughtful defense of Pasquale's perspective, a political subtext. Timpanaro, a left-wing militant, could have no sympathy for a model which denied the copists intellectual autonomy, ascribing it exclusively to the philologist, therefore isolating textual philology from the tradition which had made it possible. Double-blind experiments have been criticized from an ethical point of view. As somebody has argued, they violate the covenant of trust on which the relationship between doctor and patient is based. But the attempt to control or suppress specific data for a cognitive purpose is, if I'm not mistaken, part of the very idea of a scientific experiment, an idea which must be defended against the fashionable, often superficial skepticism which has affected or infected humanities and social sciences for decades. The cognitive and political asymmetry which is implied in the experiment is probably inevitable. Much more open to criticism is, if I'm not mistaken, the scientific status which those who conduct the double-blind experiment tacitly and irrevocably ascribe to themselves. Few people today would believe that history is the teacher of life. But from history we can learn something, a sense of limits. Any individual, including a poet, a scholar, a politician, moves within a horizon which inevitably includes an uncontrolled spot, a blind spot. The model based on the double-blind experiment does not take this blind spot into account. But experience teaches us that an experiment, any experiment, can be always reopened, starting from different questions. Research